that was edited together with Therese Christiansson and Ramya Mazé. And then second, I will present the work of a women's collective in architecture, and that's my central part, that has been working together since the 1970s in Sweden and is still active. They call themselves BIG, and as that was before, Bjarke Ingels. BIG stands, this is the group, and BIG stands for Bo i gemenskap, which translates into living in community. So I was planning to three topics. One is introduce very briefly from my book a few terms and theoretical concepts, and then speak about the women's collective from the 1970s, BIG. And I wanted to conclude also with a few words about a collective writing project that we are pursuing since winter 2019. And there are also some members of BIG, which is now in the women are now in their 80s. Also for the Bloomsbury Global Encyclopedia of Women in Architecture, that's forthcoming this year and edited by Laurie Brown and Burns. So why I find the practice of BIG so amazing is I think their work is still very, very relevant to me and very inspiring, I hope also to other people, because I think it's a fantastic example for self-organization, for self-empowerment, and also for a discussion on feminist practices of care, as well as very successful example for bringing about affordable housing and collective housing. But I want to start with an observation made by the Finnish-British anthropologist Eva Berglund in her article, Building a Real Alternative, Women's Design Service, that was published in Field Journal, that's produced here in Sheffield, #2 from 2008. Where she writes about this immense women's movement in the 1980s in London, with a particular view on the organization Women's Design Service at the time. And I wish to take this up because it shows how important the collective or collectivity was for these feminist activities. And Eva points out, and I'm reading a bit of the text now, yet the 1980s wasn't by all means just about yuppies and greed. In feminism and in architecture, it was a hopeful time. Women from the New Architecture movement, in short NAM, had campaigned successfully against sexism in the building press in the 1970s, and progressive initiatives were developing further, partly inspired by feminist research on the built environment from the USA by pioneering researchers like Dolores Hayden. So Julia Dwyer and Ann Thorne from Matrix, which you probably know, describe it as women architects tapped into a broader, burgeoning academic and professional interest in women's experiences at the time. Women's histories were uncovered, women's work reassessed, and the naturalness of gender roles was thoroughly questioned. So alongside this, it became possible to articulate a feminist critique of the built environment as a man-made product that could and should be redesigned to empower women. These were the same arguments put forward by those who eventually founded and joined the Women Design Service. Indeed, there were substantial overlaps and collaboration between Matrix and the Women Design Service and many other feminist groups at the time. And the social and professional networks that developed then, they remain to this day. There was even institutional support for women at the time. The North London Polytechnic, later University of North London, and now the London Metropolitan University, was a hub of women-centered radical architectural thinking, particularly in its innovative Women into Architecture and Building program. What was crucial, however, was the high profile given to women and women's group since the late 1970s by the Greater London Council. So the Greater London Council's Women Committee And that's a quote from Sylvia Bashevkin, one of the world's best known and generously funded experiments in municipal feminism, began work in 1982. What Eva's article talks about is the dynamic field of progressive, politicized professional work. The Women's Design Service and many other feminist and women organizations could emerge and thrive. And they could do this because there was not one outstanding practice. There was really a landscape of hundreds of groups and organizations supporting each other at the time. So I claim that feminist practice is always a collective endeavor. So in this anthology, Feminist Futures of Spatial Practice, we were scanning the field of spatial practices from a feminist perspective, including architecture, planning, design, art, urban activism, and architecture history, cultural geography, curatorial studies, and so on and so on. And we asked ourselves, actually now the transfer stopped, so perhaps we can have some slides later. So when we did this book and we chose try to find examples, then we asked ourselves which methodological approaches, what strategies have been used in this regard, what are they based upon, what histories are they based upon, and what made them that they can basically live on in the future and have an impact and so on. So in the book, we got different spatial practices, pluralisms, activisms, pedagogy, and I will explain the different themes through an example each before I speak about my main case study, which is big.
I can start sharing now if you like. It's just come through.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, let's get some slides. Exciting slides.
Yeah. The next image, please. So this is the Women's Collective, and that's that is cover of the book. So okay, that's very small. You can probably not read it, but anyway. Finished by Nina Lücke speaks about interference patterns. And by this she means transformative practices steered by actors which create overlaps and allow movements between different worlds. She foregrounds such interference patterns between, for example, academic and poetic or artistic positions as feminist approaches. And in this section, the British Pakistani architect Nisha Dawan, could you go to the slide before that?
This one?
Yeah, this one.
Great.
Argues in her contribution for critical practice of cartography or mapping. She takes migration and diaspora as a point of departure to search for other ways of representing more adequately those that have made the experience of flight and journey through different geographies and cultures. And in the work she discusses here, which was part of her PhD from Sheffield School of Architecture, cartography or mapping of a non-existing state, Kurdistan in this case, in conversation and interviews with members of the Kurdish community, becomes an ethnographic method to get in touch with the community, but also to speak about very difficult issues. So she made these sketches when sitting down with people and talking about possible or imaginary location for Kurdistan while scribbling or drawing together. Next slide, please. So this community, which is not represented by a nation state, she shows that they are represented spatially by the location of their numerous coffee houses along an existing street of London. as her mapping of this street demonstrates. And you see this mapping here, which is also an image in the book. So this work was about what she calls mapping otherwise, searching for non-Western ways of representation from a feminist position, where she questions a mainstream practice of cartography based on an assumed objective point of view from a power perspective, which eliminates the body of knowledge of a situated position, or what Donna Haraway would call the God trick. So Nishat shows that all maps are based on a selection of parameters, and that include some and exclude other information. So representations are never innocent. Her maps make space for different bodies, experiences, and other ways of visually representing them. Next slide, please. In the second part, activisms, the Swedish Chilean cultural geographer Irene Molina suggests intersectionality in her prologue as both a theoretical approach for power analysis as well as a methodological tool for action and activisms against injustices. Just to remind you, the term intersectionality was coined by the lawyer and human rights activist Kimberly Crenshaw around the end of the 80s, beginning of 90s, addressing discrimination based not only on one single oppression, but on the intersection of various ones such as gender and race. And in her case, she defended Black women in court against their employers. So in her prologue, Irene encourages spatial practitioners, such as architects and planners, to include an intersectional perspective in their work, to be aware how discriminations and privileges express spatially. And she reminds feminists then on the other side not to forget space in their power analysis, but to examine how spaces and power structures intertwine to foreground the dynamics of underlying injustices embedded in these structures so that they can be addressed by those who are in charge and who need to take informed decisions, but also by all of us to get involved to fight for change of structural discrimination. So in this part, the German architect Yvonne P. Doderer discusses silent protest as a feminist tool in the protests against the huge infrastructure project Stuttgart 21 in Germany. And that's one of her images from the protests. She reasons about the reproductive functions that maintain a protest, who is behind the scenes, who works on producing all this, the flyers and posters, the material, who organizes meetings, who takes care of protesters that were hurt in encounters with the police, so who takes care of the care work, the reproductive form of the reproductive work behind the protest that makes the protests possible, so the silent protest work. So according to her, it is a more powerful, militant and anarchistic approach to societal change than other more visible or louder forms of protest that automatically get more attention. Next slide, please. In the part dialogues, the Belgian architect and planner Nel Janssens recommends us to use the term conversation instead of discussion. And she prefers conversation as an alternative to knowledge production, stressing that this practice is about bringing together, gathering people around a theme, while traditional forms of academic exchange rather further discussion, which prefix that emphasizes on the procedure of separating and analytically taking apart. So Nell argues that conversation can bring out qualities in academic dialogue. According to her, conversation can tolerate contradictions, and their often non-linear development allows for detours, expression of preferences, and for emotions. So she sees conversation as a collective form of sense-making, especially valued for practice-oriented research, and she suggests a form of instructed conversation as an artistic research method. In the contribution to this part, the chapter by the Swedish artist Petra Bauer and the planner Sofia Wiberg, they wrote a fictive dialogue about a series of workshops they held together with a migrant women's center in Tensta, the Tensta Junsta Women's Center in a suburb of Stockholm. But these workshops that they offered together, they were basically open to all women who were interested in participating. So you have on this image, you have a look into the project space of the art center, and this furniture, and they brought in here, or this interior is basically something they designed together with the Women's Center, and it was after that series of workshops and this installation, it went then back to the Women's Center and could be used in their daily activities. So what was really interesting in this workshop, it brought together a group of highly diverse women. So I was participating as well. So we during this series of workshops, we were really changing roles. So we were acting as hosts, we were acting as workshop leaders, we were preparing food for each other, and so on and so on. So we had interesting workshops with people coming from outside, an actor speaking about racial discrimination, a Buddhist electronic musician, where we sort of explored our ancestor, and so on. So it was a really important possibility to get to know each other and to exchanging experiences. The next slide, please. So in the prologue of the part Pedagogies, the German-Swedish sociologist Nora Rätzl introduced Augusto Boal's method of forum theater, an interactive form of theater which aims to bring about social change. And here she sees an opportunity for a feminist pedagogy which raises awareness, opens to self-reflection and self-empowerment, and initiates horizontal collective action. So Rätzl, she emphasizes the function of play as an important factor hereby, which gives space for testing different perspectives and different solutions to conflicts in common. And by taking away the blame of single actors when playing through a situation that's problematic, which is a political technique to redirect attention from individuals to structural problems, power structures can be made visible, and then by this they can also be addressed. So the British architect and researcher Kim Trogel, who did actually this in her chapter, she speaks about a project she conducted here in Sheffield University together with colleagues and with students. She develops a quite nuanced understanding of feminist pedagogy in this part through the example of 3 arrangements of classroom setups. She reminds us that education is a reproductive activity aimed at reproducing values, norms, beliefs, and social and cultural hierarchies. And if we desire other futures, she argues, we need to develop other models of teaching in order to create them. So in her chapter, she speaks about teaching in educational environments with students from diverse backgrounds and articulates education as a collective practice and vision that involves teachers and students alike. A practice which needs to take equality as a principle and but works with difference. So the next slide, please. In the last part, projections, the American architectural historian Despina Stratigakos relates historical and contemporary examples of feminist strategies. And she discusses through her work on a handbook for women in Berlin from 1913. Could you switch to the next slide, please? That's the book by Despina. When the city and gender roles were changing at the time. Women were, due to industrialization, and women were moving into male professions, that a lot of new institutions and organizations popped up that made it possible for women to gain more independence. There was, for example, a bank for women, the English Lyceum Club. There was a branch opened in Berlin as well, and that gave women a possibility to meet and to create networks, but also in this ambiente of a more professional spaces to also interact with their clients. And Despina shows that similar strategies are used today than at that time, so that basically that we can learn from history, to looking into historical examples, we can learn a lot about possibilities for today and for the future. Could you go back to the slide before? Thank you. So in this last part, the Swedish architectural historian Helena Mattsson gives us an insight into the feminist architecture scene in Sweden in the 1970s and 80s. And she sketches an alternative postmodern architectural history of a constructive activism. As in contrast to this traditional understanding of postmodernity, which emphasizes form and formalism, critique and deconstruction. She foregrounds here the activist and the feminist side of postmodernity, which is rarely acknowledged. So one of Helena's examples is the group BIG, I will speak about in a minute, and she denotes their work as utopian reality and practical activism, which had a formative influence on the feminist architecture movement in Sweden. And what you see on this picture is well, two different groups of material on two shelves. So you see on the top shelf, you see the part of the archive of the Women's Building Forum, in a self-organized group, also from the 80s in Sweden, that was active then. And we had that in our shared office because the Architecture Center, Architecture and Design Center, was rejecting this material, valuable for collecting in their archive at the time. And now in the meantime, it has become part of ArcDes archive. And on the lower shelf, you see a range of journals from the 80s that presents the work of very famous postmodern architects, all male, of course. So she had this idea, if you would shift gender, if you would shift the perspective from this group of work to another group of work, you would get a completely different history writing. And then also the question, who decides what history writing is worth, is more valuable. So next slide, please. And next slide, please. Thank you. So the big group has been dealing with collective forms of housing since the 1976. And for 45 years, they have developed a model according to which around 50 houses have been built in Sweden. And these pictures are from a so-called witness seminar at the Center of Architecture and Design in Stockholm from April 2019, organized by my own research group, Action Archive, and moderated by my colleagues, Helena Mattsson and Sarah Brolund de Carvalho. You see them sitting here in the back. So witness seminars are a method of oral history that are conducted in an open format together with an informed public. Would you show the next slide, please, Anna? Yeah, here you see the public. And it's a research method developed by the Institute of British Contemporary History in the 80s, 90s. And there's an equivalent institute in Stockholm for this. So it works like a number of witnesses are invited to give short statements of 10 minutes. They speak about an event in the recent past. And the public that's part of it is usually also quite well informed and can sort of come with own thoughts, ideas, and with a lot of extra knowledge. And witness seminars are often used in the beginning of a research project when the research questions are not that entirely clear yet. Next slide, please. So BIG is a multidisciplinary group that has researched collective houses, developed models and disseminated and promoted them through publications and lectures. And for them, the collective house not only forms a house typology, but also an infrastructure for social solidarity and mutual care. Originally 10 women, the group today consists of has still 6 active members: Ingela Blomberg, Kerstin Kärnekull, Gunilla Linda, Lundahl, Ann Norby, Inga-Lisa San Gregorio, and Sonja Widén, trained as architects, journalists, planners, and art historians. And why they come together, they express in a quote, which you can find in Swedish on their homepage. So they say, "We were looking for a slightly different way of life where we would have both a private flat, but also enough common space. We saw cooperation in everyday life as a basis for community, a better environment for our children to grow up, to manage resources, and as an opportunity for a more fun and richer life. We decided to find out how such a living could look like." Next slide, please. This is an image from a catalog, from an exhibition catalog. There was an exhibition at 1980 called Boplatz 80, translated into, you could translate it into Settlement 80, which showed new concepts for living at the time, where they presented their collective house. Next slide, please. So in order to bring their community life concept to as many as possible, they developed this small collective house model for between 15, 25 units. And the model was built in a dollhouse scale, 1:12, to be furnished with dollhouse furniture. And this particular model is based on a typology from the 1930s. They showed that you could retrofit that into private flats and include also a large area, a collective area for a number of communal activities. Next slide, please. So this slide here shows, demonstrates the economic relationship, how you could make that work between private flats and collective spaces. If each flat in a house with 15 flats would give up 10% of its area, it would be possible to share a large dining room, a living room, a guest room, a laundry, sauna, and a workshop. But if 40 flats came together, then you could even have a library, a textile workshop, a table tennis room, and a games room. Next slide, please. But however, the most important space was always the kitchen and a generous dining area. And this is really one of my favorite drawings, because you see here that everybody came together in the kitchen and helped. There were children, there were men, there were women working together. And it shows also how important it is to create this spatial situation for being able to work collectively or to live collectively. So central to the BIG model was the possibility to have access to community and yet to close your own door to your flat. And while many other communes at the time popped up in suburbs, moving into large bourgeois villas, the BIG model did not address this kind of more smaller scale happenings, but they were really, the model was conceived on a broader scale as a visionary model for future living together, which took into account all areas of housing production and all the actors that you would need. So it addressed investors, urban planners, administrators, politicians, as well as the future residents, of course. And at the witness seminar, Kerstin Kärnekull puts it in this way: we really wanted to contribute to something that was actually feasible. We realized that the only way forward in Sweden in the 1970s and 80s was to find ways working with the big players in the municipal housing associations and the national cooperatives, and not trying to start co-housing groups where the groups themselves are the owners. So we didn't have the capital, we really wanted to rent, and we did not want to own a place. Imagine, we have been doing this for 45 years. Next slide, please. So to show you actually a built example, this is the Pferdkneppenhaus from 1993, a typical big concept house which has received international attention in research. It has 43 1-to-3 room flats and approximately 350 square meters of common spaces. It was the first of a series of 8 built, planned and designed for residents in a so-called second half of life, over 50 years and without small children. So these were residents who wanted to grow old together and be more independent from communal service systems, and they wanted to support each other. Next slide, please. This is a view into their kitchen, and you see some residents here, and you see also a research group from Japan in the back. The project started in 1987, by senior citizens and was designed in a participatory process. A municipal housing company in Stockholm is the owner, and the result was individual floor plans, a novelty in the municipal housing system in Sweden. So the program resembles rather a more exclusive co-housing project rather than a public housing one, with a variety of common possibilities. So they have a library, a weaving room, a laundry, a common dining room, a workspace equipped with computers and printers and all kind of things, and guest rooms. They have a common room with a open fireplace on the roof terrace, recycling rooms on the ground floor with shelves for gifts, a fitness room in the basement with sauna and food storage. And BIG was not the first collective house model. There are famous previous models in Sweden from the 1930s to 1950s, but they were based on the principle of service sharing. So they often had a restaurant in the ground floor that was run by employees, and they were also much more oriented towards the need of working women and men. They were striving for gender equality at the time, but at the same time they were also reinforcing a class society. So investors at the time had quickly lost interest in the service collective houses because they were very complex to maintain and to administer. And BIG managed to set a new wave of collective living in motion in the middle of the 70s, which was based on the division of labor between the residents. So while earlier reformist or utopian models were much more emphasizing need, the BIG model expresses specific values of co-living that go beyond the sharing and the resources of the spaces. Next slide, please. So that is a drawing that my colleague Anna Roland de Carvalho did, where she collected all the publications, the exhibitions, the built projects, some of the built projects, also documents, legal documents, law changes, and so on and so on, to create this timeline of their development. And this is my summary now, end of talk. I would claim what is remarkable about BIG's work and worth considering when planning for more resilient futures is that first, BIG's collective practice is both practical and visionary. Then second, in conversation, BIG links their personal topics, such as aging, health, family situation, partners, workload, friends, and so on, to political changes in building regulation, the introduction or cancellation of state subsidies. So they really demonstrate that how the personal is political. Then, next slide, please. The group rarely only addresses a specialist audience, but rather through its academic as well as popular scientific publications such as handbooks, guidebooks, the development of regulations, case studies, personal reflections, and text written in form of fictitious diary entries. They aim at reaching a broader audience of future tenants, clients, administrators, architects, planners, politicians, investors, and others. And you see this actually also in the work of Matrix in Britain at the time. And for Big's work shows a new attitude towards activism and feminist strategies in architecture, which has shifted from the criticism of power structures to action, to participating, for instigating real changes. So through their positions as writers in important media and also taking on positions in central organizations such as the Swedish Association of Public Housing Societies and the Swedish Chamber of Architects, for example, they had the opportunity to exert a great deal of influence to work for change. Next slide, please. So this is a slide from an exhibition, from an exhibition from the Nomadic Library of Joanango, where our book has popped up again, which it's always fun to see where your material makes sense and where it is useful. So I very briefly want to come back to the terms I spoke about in the beginning. So Nina Lücke, for example, speaks about interference patterns, and I think that's exactly what Big was doing. They were really opening up for new collaborations, bringing different sectors and disciplinary frontiers together that hadn't talked to each other before. They have also explored new forms of representation and mapping, otherwise, you could say, with their models and drawings in order to reach a wider public, something that Matrix has always also done. In their work, they exercise power analysis as well as practical activism, and it is based on a different form of care work through their collective housing model, but also practiced within their own group, which can teach us a great deal about collectivity and self-empowerment. So through their manuals and lectures, they make their models available to professionals and the public alike and reproduce feminist architectural values. So this is how I think we can learn from history, the history of the remaking of the collective house in Sweden, for example, under feminist points of view, which can serve as an inspiration for how to bring change about. Next slide, please. So very briefly about this collective writing workshop that we set up since the December 2019, I think, for writing the entries for the Bloomsbury Global Encyclopedia for women in architecture together with this group. So you see some of the members of Big here, but also people from all generations that have specific knowledge on between 1960 and 2015, which is the time that the encyclopedia addresses. And next image, please. So this is my last image. For the encyclopedia, we had been given 18 contributions because Sweden is quite small. And if you would only write biographical entries, then you would have could show only a very small section of the architectural activities by women in architecture in Sweden. So we decided from the start to rather write about groups and organizations and larger networks in order to bring a number of women together that would talk together in the individual entries. Yeah, so that was my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meike. That was very provocative, thought-provoking, and a very well researched talk. Thank you very much. We're just going to copy the Miro link again into the chat. So we've already got some questions being popped up in there. Equally, if you would like to speak up, please just pop your question or Q in the chat and then speak it on your own behalf. That would be awesome. So we've got having some thanks come through on the chat. Seems like that was very well received. I guess the first question that got put on the Miro board, and I think lots of people, given that quite a lot of us are students, and with that comes communal living in student flats, etc. We might sometimes have a slightly skewed perception of what communal living is like, and also it might be overseen more by the perhaps some of the negatives. And like, so the first question on here was, what are the main challenges faced by collective communal living?
What are the main changes?
Main challenges.
Challenges, okay, yeah. Well, I think the main challenges perhaps are things when there's very little space to withdraw. And I guess that, for example, Big have addressed this question. So they've said it's important for them to be able to close their apartment door behind them, but also to choose when you want to interact and you want to be together with others. So the idea too of this economical model that would make it possible, so each of them had a little bit smaller flat, like 10%, but for this they could also always use the communal kitchen, eat together, do not have to cook by themselves, have others taking care of your children if necessary, and so on and so on. So you could share, could share care work for each other. I think that was really an opportunity. And they were reacting on the earlier collective house model between the 30s and the 50s that was very, let's say, very well discussed in Sweden at the time, because it was such a welfare model, you know, that women could basically pursue a profession. And if you look at these flats, they are very tiny, and they usually have almost no kitchen at all. So they have perhaps like 2-3 square meters. Just you could have a tea or something, but you could not really cook a meal and invite others or so. So in the big concept house, it's possible to do both. You have a fully functioning flat, but you also have also this large common area to enjoy. And we think that is one of the interesting things with Big. And then the other very remarkable point is their willingness to collaborate with the big with the establishment, and in order to, so their idea is, if you want to make something work, then you have to make changes from inside the institution. So you can't do this as a dissident, or you cannot do it only through criticism. You really have to come with own ideas and suggestions and plan how to make them work. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered the question on the challenges. I guess the challenges were much higher at these more freestanding collectives at the time that shared a villa or so. I think that's then you have to organize yourself in space. Perhaps that takes much more effort to do that. So I guess that was also a point of departure. How do you create kind of just spaces so that everybody has a place, a room of their own, but still having access to the collective?
I think that rolls on quite nicely to another question we have on the Miro board, which draws upon, so apart from shared facilities, what other design moves were made with perhaps a more specific feminist ideology. So I think you mentioned at the beginning about how, for example, people positioning within a meeting can help provoke equality and freedom of speech, etc. So I don't know whether these levels of integrations in the way that the kitchens were formed or the entrance passages, or
you mean how that is visible in the designs somehow? Yeah, that's a good question. I think that you have, for example, if you have the possibility, if you have a kitchen that's big enough that like 20 people can be in the kitchen, and the children can be there, and several can work side by side. If you have, I don't know if you read the subtitles, there was a kitchen planner at the time who planned very many of those collective house kitchens, and so that was really a professional task, to plan a good kitchen where many people can work together. And I think in general it's important to design workspaces in the domestic so that people can collaborate on them, so that this becomes more fun to do them.
And also on the facade of the building, I noticed that the corner was almost chamfered at ground floor level. Was that also a specific design move towards perhaps not creating as like sharp edges for people walking around at night, or is this just me going too far deep into these design decisions?
I'm not sure. I would have to ask on the design decisions. I think that the building, beside let's say the spatial layout, how they were organized internally, that you had this broad range of different types of spaces in this program. Like the roof room with the open fireplace and roof terrace, and and things in the basement, and so on and so on, so that you had this possibility of moving around and meeting a lot of people, I would say. But in terms of design and materiality, I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, perhaps you could say there was really an interest in working a lot with color. I guess that is more obvious. But perhaps one thing you should know is they were not all designing these buildings. They had made a concept, and then there were a lot of other architects designing these buildings. So what is not necessarily their own design. That was on a much more programmatic level.
Thank you. We have a next question. We've literally got questions firing on all cylinders here. So we'll try and pick out questions that maybe relate to what was said before / what came first. So Emma, you have a question in the chat. I don't know if you would like to pipe up and ask it yourself.
I think she's had to leave. But might be worth it.
I'll read it out then. So she sends her thanks. She's really interested also to hear how you are collectively doing the work on the Bloomsbury Global Encyclopedia of Women in Architecture.
Well, when we started, we got asked by the area editor in Spain in commission. I mean, as a laureate for Karen, if Helena Mattsson, I was work with, and Therese Christiansson, who was also one of my co-editors with the book, if we could take care of the Swedish entries. And so when we met, then we started first. I gave a seminar course at the School of Architecture, inviting students to come with ideas about what is an encyclopedia, what should it contain, what should it not contain, who is invited, who is not invited, who makes that decision at all, and so on. So that was that was an interesting journey in itself. And partly students have also collaborated in writing entries. And then we decided that we need just broader, we do not have that knowledge. You know, we cannot say anything about the 1960s if we haven't been part of this, that we have to sort of bring a group together of researchers and writers, from practitioners from many generations, to have a more fruitful discussion. So then we started to have these seminars, we met a lot of people, and we distributed the different writing tasks. So we made up the different topics together, and then we distributed the writing tasks. And then we were reading all entries and we were commenting on them. And partly we have also written them together. So we I think one entry is a conversation between 3 people across different generations. So I think this generational aspect has always been extremely important to us.
We had our Feminist Library presentation discussion, which kicked off our week. And I think there's probably quite a lot of similarities between all, something that we'll be referencing. So I think everyone's here, it's a good reference point for us. And hopefully we're going to distribute this amount of information throughout the school prior to this lecture. So thank you very much for opening up this new avenue of information for us. The next question comes from Karim. Again, Karim, if you'd like to ask a question personally, feel free to unmic. If not, I'll ask his question. Or actually, it's just actually sending his best wishes. I didn't read that far. Sorry, Karim.
Can you hear me? Right, okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say hi, Mike. Good to see you.
Nice.
No, thank you. Really appreciate your finding
you.
the time, especially on a Friday evening. Also, thank you, Mimi and team SUAS. Okay, great work.
Thanks, Karim.
Yes.
We got similar vibes from Kith, who's had to run and do the bedtime run. Yeah. But she sends her thanks for a brilliant talk. So we also have a question from Helen. She's less of a question. It's more of a question, her own thoughts on the matter. I don't know, again, if Helen would like to unmic. If not, I will read it out on your behalf. So she says, I think the broadening out of feminist concerns to embrace other aspects of aging populations and also the notion of collective actions and accessible dissemination was really inspiring.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm actually out walking, so that's why I wasn't going to unmic. I thought that was I really enjoyed that. Broadening out, but also I think, the relevance of feminist ways of working for beyond kind of gender and those sort of collaborative actions, I thought was really, really important, and link into, matrix, I think, and the whole idea of sort of empowerment of women in the kind of building industry, but in, learning those skills as well. I thought that was really interesting.
Thank you.
I think you summarised it as something like the landscape of architects supporting each other as a form of collective, and I think that's a really nice way of phrasing it.
Yeah.
That it is all about a collaborative approach. Our next question is from SUAS. Will?
Is that me? Yeah, thank you. That was a really lovely talk and really interesting. It kind of links into one of the questions on the board, which is about how applicable it is in a collective living is in different cities and different countries. Because in the UK, sort of co-housing, communal living is sort of a minority of housing provision. And so I was wondering how applicable it is, and also because did you say it was state-owned? So how does sort of the management run? Because I do know that some challenges faced by co-living communities are sort of who manages it and which residents are more active and which residents are more passive. So yeah, is it applicable? How does the state ownership work as well? That'd be quite interesting.
Well, you had in Sweden, you had a non-profit housing system until 2011, until it was dismantled. There was then a law that even these non-profit housing companies, that they have to make profit. But even, yeah, since you can say since the 90s, there was, like in all other European countries at least, there was a big selling out of the public housing stock. Sweden never had social housing. It was always a public housing. It was always the idea that people, or everybody should rent, and everybody, you know, that you build flats not only for people that were less well off, but flats that would be attractive to everybody. And so these collective houses, they really also some of them have also been sold off. I mean, the flats to the inhabitants, but there is still a large number of collective houses that are still maintained and administered by the public housing companies, and they are municipal housing companies. So every city had, like Stockholm has 3 different companies that administer and maintain those public housing. So it is still let's say a working system. And there's a lot of there. I know everybody who knows Stockholm knows how impossible it is to find a flat that you have. We are all forced to buy our flats nowadays, but there's a huge interest also, especially also by young people and students to, you know, to come back to a functioning rental system.
Yeah, definitely. I think because we've had some talks from architects who have, I think certainly over the past 12 months have downplayed some aspects of communal living, given we've sort of gone through this period of really severe social isolation. So I don't know, in my head it's sort of communal living makes sense as something to really push for in the future, because everyone's living together and you can have those live-work environments that give people those spaces. But yeah, that was a lovely answer, so thanks.
Our next question, I think, will come from Delphine, if you'd like to unmic.
Yeah, hi, it's quite relatable to what Will just asked. I was wondering, your social housing scheme works at a smaller scale of 40 people approximately, 40 flats, and you also mentioned it's just for people who are in the second half of their life. So I was wondering, do you think that if it works that well for that group of society, do you think it's expandable to the whole of society, or do you think it's a mindset that doesn't work as well as that to different cultures? So basically, does it work because of the architecture, or does it work because of the inhabitants' will to make it work?
Well, I think it's both. You know, I guess you need also the spaces for collectivity, but these buildings, they came about through the pressure and the ideas of the inhabitants. Also now that these particular projects for people older than 50 or so, and I think nowadays I mean, people can make suggestions to the housing companies, you know, that they wish that buildings should be built for particular groups and so on. So I think there's pressure, you know, there are desires and wishes, and there are groups coming together and asking for it. And nowadays you have in Sweden, as in many other European countries, you have also co-housing. More and more co-housings are built, and that's in this case the people are the owners. So it's a very different system. And also when they sell it off, then they sell it off through speculation. So I think there are many problems with that. So I personally think, I mean, that's not in relation to Sweden, but for example, in Berlin, you have these cooperative societies that you have that in Austria as well, and you have also cooperative system in Switzerland, which I think is extremely interesting, and it's extremely well functioning. So there's a lot of focus on to solve the housing crisis, to these mixed systems where you are partly an owner of the whole system, you're a co-owner of the whole system, but you also rent your flat. And when you move out, you cannot speculate on it, so you cannot sell it off in a speculative process.
Thank you. I think, just looking at the time, there's one more question on the Miro which I think we'll bring up, and I don't know if anyone else had any questions before I do ask this last question. But I think maybe it's quite a nice way to round off our last 5 days at the Sheffield School of Architecture. And the question is, hopefully it's a little bit of a challenging question, but it is, if you had to describe the feminist ideology in 2 sentences, what would it be?
Oh, difficult. I mean, collectivity is certainly a part of it. That most practices, we really rely on the support of each other. So I think that's an important ideology, if you like. Well, I guess the other part is the importance of being aware of power struggles, sharpening your awareness of, and also trying to find together then different tools to counter them or to make them useful for your movement. Yeah, I think that feminist practices, what is at the core, and I agree with Bell Hooks, is really a struggle for social justice, and it goes much beyond questions of gender, diversity. It's also about socioeconomics and so on and so on. So it's really an intersectional idea here.
Well, I think that's a lovely way to end today's talk. And I think for everyone who has attended, I think being at Sheffield School, we get involved a lot with a feminist approach and practice, whereas people coming perhaps from other universities, or when we talk about with our friends and our family, often to try and also sum up what it is that we design for can be quite complicated. So I think that's a lovely way of, like, for us as well, to kind of be able to encapsulate it and hopefully pass on the great message and motto of what feminism is. So again, lots of thanks coming through on the chat, lots of praise, lots of great discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. Sincerest apologies about the hiccup at the beginning. It was something on our technical side. So yeah, that lovely lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank
It was
you.
fantastic to be here.
It's great.
Right, take care.
Thank you.